Hi there. Today we're going to be looking at regions and identifying the characteristics and types of regions that you should need to be aware of, and then hopefully be able to discuss a little bit more about why geographers define regions as they do to understand and better study individual places. Looking at the definition of regions, basically it's defined as a general area where we're going to find unifying characteristics, and there is no absolute into what those characters are, but they tend to be the most prevailing or significant characteristics of that particular place. There's no formal definition, and so there's no boundaries. It's loosely defined. And those boundaries can differ depending on what characteristics you might emphasize or compare. But they're used to provide convenient comparisons of things that have common characteristics. As we look at regions themselves can be of very different sizes. They can be as small as a neighborhood or as big as all of Western Europe, as we talk about. It depends, again, on the scale that we're considering. Usually we're going to be looking at localized or comparing several different entities. Maybe it's countries. It could be even counties or states if we're looking at the United States in particular. But we're usually looked at specific characteristics, whether it's climate, cultural characteristics like religion, ethnicity, language, things like that would be a very unifying and clear impact, have a clear impact on the way of life or a particular region itself. As we look at them more specifically, something to be thinking about is that regions themselves are not a static entity. They change through time. If we consider the American West, going back to the earliest American settlers, the West initially started out as being reaching the Appalachian Mountains, and as we started to see Western expansion, the West became the Northwest Territory of Ohio, Indiana, and it extended eventually to the Great Lakes region, into what we would call the Midwest today. And then as we moved into the 19th and 20th century, it extends all the way to the West Coast into the Pacific. So we can see how the idea of a region can change over time. One thing to consider is this idea of a regional identity fits into what William Patterson's 4 themes of geography, or traditions of geography, and one of which is a regional studies. And one of the things that you want to highlight about this is one of the more modern traditions, in that we care about local diversity, but we are also concerned about the global impact of connectedness. As we see a more globalized world, we can't dispute the fact that we are influenced by other regions of the world. But we also like to look at specific and unique characteristics of a particular place. The other traditions still play a part in geography, but some of them considered to be outdated or have not been as emphasized as much. However, we'll also look at some of the spatial traditions and consider some of the impacts that are involved with some of these other traditions. As we look at these, one of the theories or ideas that came about is from Carl Sauer, and the idea of possibilism. And this is where we start looking at at human society's ability to change the landscape, that we do have an impact on particular regions, and there is a significant interaction between the physical environment and human society. As we look formally at the 3 types of regions, there are formal regions, the functional regions, and perceptual regions. Perceptual regions are, generally speaking, very loosely defined. They have no boundaries. It's when we consider the American South. Functional regions are going to extend to an influential zone, and so that maybe there could be particular boundaries, but generally they're based off of a node or a central point, and then their sphere of influence permeates from that. And then the formal regions are going to be where you have either defined boundaries, or that it's a significant characteristic that is represented by a significant majority, and can be a general characteristic to describe a particular region. So looking more specifically at formal regions, they're also known as uniform or homogeneous regions. And this is that common characteristic, and this could be an economic activity like agriculture in the Midwest, that we produce a lot of corn. It could also be language, or a religious belief. And so we can look at it in three particular examples. It could be looking at local governments. You notice the congressional districts here represented in Minnesota. These are formal regions. Those boundaries are defined and represent a different voting population, and that can be defined by, are they voting Republicans or Democrats? Another one is looking at things like agriculture, as I mentioned, corn. You can see we're in production of corn. There are very formal regions where corn is produced, and that's based on some of the environmental characteristics that, as well as the actions of the human societies. We can look at religion, the Bible Belt, where we see the predominance of Baptist Christians. Voting trends. We can look at the 2004 election, and we can see where people voted for Bush and Kerry by party, and we can move that forward to the 2008 election, and we look at McCain or Obama, and we see very similar formal regions. And if you just change the type of visualization we have and use more of a cartographic map here, you can see that the Northeast is very much would be considered a formal Democratic region. Even though that doesn't represent everyone, it's predominant. There's a majority there, and it's a pattern that has played out over time, and therefore we can start to define it as a region. What to keep in mind? Are they homogeneous? Absolutely not. And there are always minorities. We want to be careful not to stereotype to the extent of not to consider some of the variations within. It's like saying in New York, there are no Republicans. It's not true, obviously. So keeping that in mind, let's move on to functional regions. Functional regions are also known as nodal regions. And we look around a specific node or focal point, and that is a central place. And one example I always think of is like the New York subway system. Considering that you have Grand Central Station, and then you have from that you have emanating all the subway lines out of New York City. Where those lines end really ends the boundaries, or forms the boundaries of that particular functional region. So let's take a look at a couple more of these. A functional region could be a city. This is San Francisco. If we look at the functional region of its accessibility in central San Francisco, the economic activity, the ports that are central along the San Francisco Peninsula and those surrounding areas. We could look at something like Rapid City and just look at the functional area. If you look at a relatively rural area, that the functional purpose it serves for that surrounding area. And as you look at those rings, you can imagine there's a distance decay that people very close to Rapid City would rely on the goods and services and the economic activities that occur in Rapid City. As you move further and further away, it's going to be less influential. Here's a map of the New York City subway, another representation of a functional region. Moving on to vernacular regions, also known as perceptual regions, we can look at this as part of that idea of that identifying characteristics, part of a cultural identity, if you will. And so, again, this is where you're going to start to see very informal, and it's maybe more difficult. That can be difficult to represent geographically, and so they don't necessarily have to be absolute and accurate. It's sort of an attachment, and this might be the sense of place where people view themselves, or it could be viewed from the outside. And so we looking at an example of the South. There's all kinds of definitions and that play into the role of defining the South. And if we take those different characteristics and overlay them and make this visual mashup, you can see that those boundaries vary, but that general idea, or the vernacular view of the South, you get a general sense of where that would be in considering all these characteristics. So if we look at regions, take a second to pause and reflect and say, what are regions? For what purpose do geographers create regions? What are the three types of regions? And how are these regions organized? Hopefully this is helpful, and determining and defining what regions are. If you have any questions, please make sure you talk to me or contact me, email me, let me know so I can help you understand them better.